Stalin is well known for the atrocities his regime committed from 1924 to his death in 1953. Over his 24-year rule, Stalin would be responsible for the death of millions, although reports of the exact number he killed vary from source to source. Some sources say as low as 28 million people were killed, with other estimates being as high as 127 million. Most people that are interested in history, particularly that of the Soviet Union, acknowledge that these crimes happened. However, like with most instances of genocide, there are those who apologize, justify, and outright deny these crimes. Although it is well known that there are people who deny events such as the Holocaust and the Armenian Genocide, the denial of Soviet crimes and those of Stalin are less covered within the popular historical consciousness. In this video, I will show you instances of apologia and denial, disprove them, and tell you why it's important to fight against it. Now, the UN defines genocide as being at least one of 5 categories. A. Killing members of the group. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And E. Forcibly transferring children of the group. While legally this is the definition of genocide, I really won't be using this definition for this video. This is because the definition itself is too constrained in its crimes. It doesn't mention things like politicide, ethnocide, or random genocide, all of which were committed under Stalin. And because the definition of genocide is so unclear about certain crimes, it has been disputed by legal scholars ever since Raphael Lemkin coined the term in 1944. Additionally, countries like the Soviet Union and the United States ensured that genocide involving social or political groups were not to be included in this definition in order to avoid accountability for their own past crimes. Therefore, rather than using the blanket term of genocide, I will be using the terms democide, genocide, politicide, mass murder, random genocide, and genocide as a result of purposeful or negligent famine to describe Stalin's atrocities. In the Encyclopedia of Genocide Volume 1, Israel W. Charney defines the aforementioned terms. To start, he defines democide as the murder of a person or people by a government. Ethnocide is defined as the destruction of a group's culture through slavery, deportation, torture, rape, sexual slavery, and the prohibition or disruption of non-lethal religious customs and practices. Politicide is defined as the intentional mass murder of people who pose supposed political threats to a regime. Mass murder is the murder of any large number of people. Finally, random genocide is the random mass killing of any victim who is easily accessible. Now, I bring up these terms because they are the most relevant to the crimes of Stalin that I will be speaking on. These terms and their definitions are agreed upon by legal scholars to be crimes. Although they aren't legally the definitions or the ones that are implemented by the UN, they are still morally wrong and are crimes within their own right. In this video, I will cover 3 different events that happened under Stalin's regime. The ones that I'll be covering are the Holodomor, the Great Purge, and the deportations of certain ethnic groups during the Second World War. I will focus on these crimes in particular because these events have the most discourse around them. Essentially, they are the most known to people from the Western world. The most infamous of crimes committed under Stalin is the 1932 to 1933 Holodomor. For some background, 3 years prior to the start of the famine, Stalin had begun to implement collectivization policies on Soviet peasant farms. In fact, 60 million people would be pushed onto these collective farms by the end of February 1930. As it is well known, peasants of all stripes would be pushed together. The kulaks, who were wealthy landowning peasants, were most opposed to this because they lost their land given to them by Lenin. And because they were upset about having their lands confiscated, they begun to oppose the policy of collectivization. Stalin, in turn, would begin a policy of dekulakization in order to not only get rid of any potential powerful opposition from the kulaks, but to also encourage other peasants to work on these collective farms. It should be noted that the Stalin regime labeled the kulaks as class enemies. Subsequently, the Soviet government would start deporting or executing kulaks, with as many as 1.5 million suffering either of these fates. This, combined with the increasingly unrealistic farming quotas, would bring a famine in Ukraine ever closer. The Holodomor would officially start in August of 1932, following the implementation of the 5 stocks of grain decree. The 5 stocks of grain decree essentially made it punishable by death or imprisonment for anyone to take any amount of grain or other produce from a collective farm. Almost 60,000 people would be tried and sentenced as a result of this decree alone. The rate of starvation was even worse, with around 28,000 people dying daily as a result of starvation. Despite the millions of people starving any day, Stalin only sent a small amount of grain, potatoes, and other crops to Ukraine relative to the population at the time. Had he completely opened the grain reserves, there would have been enough food to feed at least 10 million people. But by the end of the famine in summer of 1933, because of these deliberate acts by Stalin, an estimated 3 to 10 million people had died. The Holodomor fits under the definitions of genocide as a result of famine and politicide. Although Stalin himself did order aid to Ukraine in February of 1933, that doesn't absolve him from the fact that the famine was made exponentially worse by the collectivization policies that he implemented. On December 1st, 1934, Sergei Kirov was shot by Leonid Kikalayev in the Communist Party headquarters in the city of Leningrad. Kirov was the boss of the Leningrad Party organization and publicly was a close friend and supporter of Stalin. However, in private, this was a much different story. Kirov had allegedly become more opposed to Stalin's collectivization and industrialization policies. In fact, on Stalin's 50th birthday, 6 years before the murder, Kirov had actually written a speech that disavowed Stalin and his rule. Whether or not Stalin was actually behind the murder of Kirov was and still is unclear. Despite this, Stalin took the opportunity to clamp down on supposed anti-Stalinist and anti-Soviet elements within the Communist Party. The Great Purge, as it became known, wouldn't really start until the trial of the 16 in December of 1936. The trial of the 16 would see 16 defendants, most notably old Bolsheviks Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Ivan Smirnov, face a show trial after being falsely accused of illegal acts against the Red Army. All 16 were then executed. All of the officials who were charged at this trial were Trotskyites or had shown some level of opposition to Stalin. Soon after, the trial of the 17 and the trial of the Red Army generals saw lesser officials and higher-ups within the Soviet military also face show trials followed by execution. The last trial, the trial of the 21, would happen in March of 1938. This trial would see right opposition communists, most notably Nikolai Bukharin, be executed. Along with the sham trials of higher-up Soviet officials, the ordinary Soviet citizenry was not spared. The Soviet secret police, the NKVD, would be given immense powers to hunt down so-called enemies of the people. A supposed 750,000 to 1 million people would be arrested and or killed by the NKVD over the course of the Purge. Additionally, Stalin would use the NKVD to target certain ethnic minorities, most notably Ukrainians, Poles, Baltics, Koreans, and Eastern Germans. The Great Purge falls under the categories of ethnocide, random genocide, and politicide. The targeting of certain minorities, the targeting of random Soviet citizens, and the sham trials of Stalin's opponents all show this. When it comes to the deportations, I will be mainly focusing on the deportations of certain ethnic groups from the Caucasus and certain areas of Russia and Ukraine, not necessarily the deportations of the Baltics or Soviet satellite states after the end of the Second World War. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, this led to the deportations of certain ethnic groups over the course of the war. In the immediate aftermath of the German invasion, the Supreme Soviet, or the Soviet Parliament, issued a decree in August 1941 to abolish the Volga Germans' autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. Subsequently, on September 1st, the Soviet government began deporting around 440,000 Volga Germans to mines, labor camps, factories, and farms in Central Asia. Later, in February of 1944, the Soviet government also began deporting the various peoples of the Caucasus, Kuban region, and Crimea. These groups included the Balkars, Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Ingush, Karachi, Kalmyks, and Mishketians. The reasons for the deportations and the treatment that they suffered were similar amongst all of these groups. Firstly, they were all accused by Soviet authorities of collaborating with the Germans. Although there were members of these groups that did collaborate with the Germans, that does not justify the mass deportations of hundreds of thousands of people. And in any case, Russians and other groups also collaborated with the Germans and were not deported for it. Secondly, all of these people were deported to Central Asia in cattle cars, which were very similar to the ones used by the Nazis to deport Jews during the Holocaust. The property of those who were deported would quickly be taken by neighbors and Russian settlers. Thousands would die as a result of the poor conditions they were forced into, with groups like the Crimean Tatars and the Volga Germans facing mortality rates of 50 and 40% respectively. This obviously falls into the category of ethnocide due to the deliberate targeting of these groups for their culture. There are many examples from the years these crimes happened to today of people apologizing, excusing, and justifying them. When actually viewing instances of denials and apologies when it pertains to these events in particular, you'll begin to see some patterns that echo amongst the three. These patterns mostly involve apologia or excuses for the crimes. And although there are instances of outright denials of these crimes, particularly that of the Holodomor, they are not as common. Even worse, the crimes are viewed with much favor amongst some supporters of the Soviet Union and Stalin. When looking at the patterns themselves, you'll most likely see occurrences of people downplaying horrific acts, mocking the victims, saying that these events were some kind of a necessary evil, or whataboutisms. For example, with the Holodomor, you'll see statements along the lines of, quote-unquote, Stalin ate all the grain. Apologists will point to things like industrialization, improvement of literacy and unemployment rates, and other advancements which brought some progress to the Soviet Union, even though it saw millions die to achieve it. One example of this I'd like to bring up comes from this user on r/debate communism. This example comes as a response to the question, did Stalin send aid to the Ukraine? Although yes, Stalin did personally order aid to Ukraine, it isn't as simple as this user makes it out to be. The relief itself was mainly focused on the cities within the Ukrainian SSR, with little of those going to the countryside. Even in the more urban regions of Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk, there are many instances of severe starvation leading to cannibalism. A Soviet report from April 1st, 1933, titled Report of the Information Sector of the Organizational Department of the Central Committee of the CPU on the Facts of Hunger and Malnutrition in Certain Regions of the Republic, describes several brutal instances within Dnipropetrovsk. 3 examples it provides are from the village of Petrochapry, which is within the Alexandrovsky district of Dnipropetrovsk. The report states, quote, in the village of Petrochapry, a collective farm worker who harbored bandits, a thief lured her 10-year-old stepdaughter to her, killed her, and roasted her parts. After 2 to 3 days in the same village, the brother, the husband of this collective farmer, a criminal bandit, was caught at the scene of the crime. He killed an old woman and a 20-year-old daughter and burned parts of the body. The fact that the collective farmers literally had to eat each other in order to survive serves as a testament to the lack of any real effort on the part of the Soviet authorities. Mind you, Dnipropetrovsk had the highest amount of aid sent to it out of any other region within Ukraine in February of 1933. Other regions also faced massive rates of starvation for months after the aid packages of February. Another Soviet report titled, quote, The Report of the National Committee of Health Protection of the USSR Central Committee on the Health State of the Population of the Kiev region in connection with food difficulties from June 1933 outlines the famine within the region around the city of Kiev. In the report, the amount of people that were suffering through starvation had increased from March 25th to April 15th. On March 25th, 398,201 people were starving. By April 15th, that number had grown to 493,644 people. The same thing was true for the amount of people that had starved to death. The chart that the report provides counts the amount of deaths from the start of 1933 to date. From January 1st to March 25th, 14,548 people had died. By April 15th, 27,809 people had died. That's an increase of 13,261 people. When people started replying to this Reddit user who supported Stalin's act, said user downplayed the severity of the famine or engaged in whataboutisms. Their second response, as shown, is even more dishonest. Firstly, it downplays the famine by saying that Stalin himself wandered around and ate people. Then they state a whataboutism to try and focus on the West's own failings. The links that the user provides as supposed proof that the USSR was better than they objectively were are also meant to add on to the whataboutism. In general, all of these links do not really pertain to Stalin himself, nor the Holodomor. The CIA memo dates to January 1st, 1983. The second link is to literacy reach, which only is not on topic, but it also shows how the Soviet government more or less favored the Russians, as the article itself states that many of the non-Russian ethnic groups within the USSR had high illiteracy rates. The last link is in regards to unemployment rates within the USSR. Mind you, Stalin's USSR made unemployment legal, which is dishonest. Much of the same sort of downplaying can be seen within discussions around the purges. Outright denial of the purges, saying that they were propaganda or fabricated, is exceptionally rare in these circles. The most common justification for the purges is that there were Nazis and general anti-Soviet elements within the Soviet Union. Essentially, their main argument is that the purges were a necessary evil to rid the Soviet Union of alleged counter-revolutionaries. In these two examples, the users play down the numbers or just make a blanket statement. Not all apologists will make a sweeping justification, however. Some may just state that there were Nazis amongst those who were purged. Occasionally, you may see some who completely deny that Stalin had anything to do with the purges, and that all the blame should be solely put on the chief of the NKVD, Nikolai Yezhov. For the most part, they completely ignore the quotas that were set by lower and higher levels of the Soviet government, which caused the deaths and false internment of thousands of Soviet citizens. In one such example from February 4th, 1938, Yuli Kaganovich, the first secretary of the Gorky Regional Committee and brother of Lazar Kaganovich, states, "The work of the Troika is complete. Within the quota for this region, 9,600 kulaks, SRs, rebels, and other anti-Soviet elements have been sentenced. In addition, some kulak and White Army elements conducting subversive activities have been discovered. In total, up to 9,000 kulak anti-Soviet elements are registered in the region. The Regional Party Committee requests additional quotas of 3,000 for first category arrests, which mind you were executions, and 2,000 second category arrests, which were gulags, and to extend the deadline until March 20th. Not only does this report directly mention the existence of such quotas, but they were actively being increased by the Soviet government. More so, this message was sent to the Central Committee and was addressed to Stalin personally. An even more damning piece of evidence that refutes the arguments made by the apologists comes from a report on January 1st of the same year. The report is a response from the Central Committee to Nikolai Yezhov, who had requested for the quotas to increase. The report states, 1. Adopt a proposal of the USSR NKVD to confirm additional acts of repression against former kulaks, criminals, and active anti-Soviet elements for the following regions and republics. The report then provides a graph of the specific regions and SSRs that had their quotas raised. Logically, if all of those arrested were really Nazis or any other anti-Soviet elements, why would there need to be a quota? Why couldn't the NKVD just conclusively find the number of those responsible and arrest them? After all, they definitely had the capabilities to have done so. And how would Stalin, being leader of the country, not know about this? I think that would make you an incompetent leader, but some people don't see it as such. Similarly, when it comes to the deportations of certain ethnicities from the Caucasus and parts of the Southwest Soviet Union, the blanket defense of there were Nazis is also common. To restate, yes, there were SS divisions and other German military formations that had members from the groups that were deported. However, there were other units, such as the East Turkish Armed League of the SS, which was composed mainly of Azeris and Central Asians, whose groups were not deported en masse. This main argument likely stems from needing to always agree with Stalin, so much to the point where they need to be hypocrites to not damage their own worldview. Some people may also try to argue that these deportations were actually migrations. I think most people would, rightfully so, view this with suspicion. Taking the Crimean Tatars as an example, I suppose that it's likely that upwards of 368,000 people, according to the International Committee for Crimea, all decided that to all get up and leave for the same place, all within the span of 3 days. Seems legit. Frankly, you should already know why these points are wrong, so I won't repeat myself. To wrap this up, we have to answer the question of why fighting back against the denial of Stalin's crimes is important. Mainly, it follows the same reasons as why it's important to fight against Holocaust denial. It is important to keep permanently within the public consciousness the reality of the crimes that were committed in the name of communism and Joseph Stalin. Just like the Holocaust, the needless deaths and exploitations of millions should not go unforgotten. The victims of Stalin should serve as a grim yet important reminder of what can happen if we let extremism rule unchecked.